She thought she had the perfect marriage, until one message exposed the ultimate betrayal. It started with late nights, distant conversations, and a feeling she couldn't shake. But when she finally uncovered the truth, it wasn't just an affair. It was something much worse. A lie so deep, so twisted, it shattered everything she believed in. What would you do if the person you trusted the most was living a double life? Stay till the end, because this story will change the way you see love, trust, and betrayal forever. The kind of night that made you think everything in the world was at peace, even if it wasn't. The soft hum of distant city traffic, muffled by the dense trees that lined the quiet street, was the only thing breaking the silence. A faint smell of wet earth filled the air, lingering from the brief but heavy rain that had passed through earlier. The street lamps flickered every few seconds, casting long shadows across the road like silent sentinels watching over the houses below. There, in the middle of this suburban calm, stood a house that seemed just like all the others, 2 stories, painted in soft shades of cream and beige, with the kind of manicured lawn that spoke of a life lived by a certain set of rules. The front door stood ajar, letting a sliver of warm light spill out into the night. If you looked closely enough, you might notice the fine details that spoke of a home carefully curated: a vase of fresh lilies on the windowsill, the soft hum of music playing in the background, the family photos lining the hallway as though life had been nothing but joy and celebration. Inside, the house was just as it appeared to be from the outside: normal, familiar, comfortable. But nothing truly was. Not anymore. The soft scrape of a chair against wood broke the stillness, and from the kitchen, a figure emerged into the dimly lit living room. Rachel stood at the edge of the room, her fingers wrapped around a glass of wine, the edges of her lips curling into a tight, thin line. The house had been hers and Daniel's once, their shared dream built from years of work and whispered promises. But tonight, it felt foreign. It felt like a place she was visiting, a house she no longer recognized. Rachel glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10. Daniel was late. Again, she had tried to wait up for him, sitting on the couch with her legs tucked beneath her, staring out at the darkened street, hoping that tonight, something might shift, that maybe they could finally have the conversation they had been avoiding for months. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the glass to her lips, the cool liquid a temporary balm to the ache inside her chest. It didn't work. Nothing had been working for a while now. The sound of the front door creaked open, breaking her thoughts. Rachel quickly stood up, straightening herself as though she had been caught in the middle of something. A second later, Daniel walked in. His dark hair was a bit messier than usual, his eyes a little too distant. He glanced at her, his lips barely curling into a smile, before shrugging off his jacket and tossing it onto the chair by the door. "Hey," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. But Rachel could see it, the edge of something else. Something was off, and it wasn't just his fatigue. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "You're late." Daniel didn't respond right away. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze wandering to the floor before meeting hers again. His smile was gone now. "I had a long day," he muttered. Rachel didn't buy it. They hadn't talked like they used to, not in months, and the excuses were beginning to pile up in a way that felt too familiar. "You've been saying that a lot lately," she said quietly, her voice tight with frustration that had been building. Daniel's eyes flickered, a brief moment of guilt crossing them before he quickly masked it. He moved past her without a word, heading toward the kitchen. The tension in the room thickened, and for the briefest moment, Rachel considered letting it go. Maybe it was just another bad day. Maybe the silence didn't mean anything, but it wasn't the silence that bothered her anymore. It was the distance. She set the wine glass down on the coffee table, its contents sloshing dangerously close to the edge, and followed him. As she entered the kitchen, she saw Daniel leaning against the counter, his back to her as he poured himself a drink, a glass of whiskey that, by the way he held it, seemed like more of a ritual than a need. He didn't even look at her. "Daniel," she paused, her voice breaking the stillness. He didn't respond. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, the frustration at the games they'd been playing, the lies she could no longer pretend not to see. "What's going on?" He let out a long, slow sigh, finally turning to face her. His eyes met hers, but there was no warmth there, only a cool indifference that made her stomach turn. "Nothing," he said flatly. I'm just tired. But it was the way he said it, like it was the last excuse he'd ever offer. Like everything that had come before it didn't matter anymore. Rachel shook her head, stepping closer to him. She was so close now, close enough to feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of his cologne, the familiarity of him that now felt strange. Don't lie to me, Daniel, she said softly, her voice trembling. You're never just tired. We've been doing this for months, and I can't do it anymore. The air in the room thickened, heavy with the weight of her words. Daniel stood still for a long moment, not saying anything, as though considering his next move carefully. Finally, he set the glass down with a decisive clink and looked at her, really looked at her. I don't know what you want from me, Rachel, he said, his voice colder now. You've changed. You've been different for months, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if I want to anymore. Her heart slammed against her ribcage, a sharp ache spreading through her chest. The words hit her harder than any of the fights they had had before, harder than the cold silences, harder than the distance that had grown between them over the years. This was the final blow. The words she had been avoiding hearing, the words that shattered the fragile illusion she had been holding on to. You're right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm different. Because I'm tired, too. Daniel's gaze softened for just a second, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Rachel could feel it in her bones, the slow realization creeping in that this was the end. The betrayal had been building for months, years, even, and it had reached a point where neither of them knew how to turn back. Maybe this was always coming, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that burned in her eyes. Maybe we just didn't see it. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, as though he couldn't face the truth of it any longer. Rachel stood there, frozen, watching as he retreated into the silence that had come to define their marriage. Her heart was heavy, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't untangle. But deep down, she knew. She had always known. The house was still, too still, and for the first time in years, Rachel felt the weight of their shared history pressing down on her, suffocating her. The quiet hum of the world outside seemed so distant, so irrelevant now. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when the subtle cracks had begun to show in their perfect life. But now, as the realization sank in, Rachel couldn't ignore the truth any longer. They had both been living in a lie, and this was the price. She turned away from Daniel, her hands shaking as she walked back to the living room. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, a stark contrast to the life they had once built together. The air felt colder now, and as she sat back down on the couch, she couldn't help but wonder how they had gotten here. And yet, even as the questions swirled in her mind, she knew one thing with a certainty she hadn't felt in months: this was only the beginning. The lies would unravel, the truth would come out, and everything they had built together, was about to fall apart, and there was no turning back. The days that followed the confrontation in the kitchen passed in a strange haze. Time seemed to stretch and contract in odd rhythms, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Daniel and Rachel still shared the space, still occupied the same rooms, but there was an invisible wall between them, more impenetrable than any physical one could ever be. Rachel found herself wandering through the house, her mind spinning with thoughts that she could barely keep up with. She couldn't stop thinking about that moment, Daniel's words, cold and final. She couldn't remember the last time she'd truly felt heard, truly felt seen. But what hurt most was that, deep down, she knew she hadn't been the only one keeping secrets. It was easy to get caught up in the drama of the present, but Rachel knew better. Secrets always had a way of revealing themselves, even the ones that were buried deep. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the cracks between them weren't just in their relationship, they were in the very foundation of everything they had built together. One afternoon, a few days after the fight, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table when she heard the unmistakable sound of Daniel's phone buzzing. She glanced over at him, catching him mid-sentence, trying to explain something trivial about work. But his eyes flickered to the screen of his phone, just a quick glance, almost imperceptible, and then, with an unconvincing smile, he reached over to silence it. It wasn't just the glance that caught Rachel's attention. It was the way he had done it, like he had something to hide. She didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to let the nagging suspicion claw its way into her thoughts. But it was there, and it was hard to ignore. There was a part of her that wanted to trust him, to believe that everything would work itself out. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that trust had long since been fractured. Rachel's suspicions began to eat away at her. She found herself looking for signs in everything. The late nights. The sudden bursts of anger when she asked a simple question. The way he no longer touched her the way he used to, as if there was some invisible boundary that had been drawn between them. She began to feel like an outsider in her own life. And if she was being honest with herself, a part of her resented him for it. For making her feel small. For making her feel like she had to compete for his attention, his affection. One evening, as the sun set low and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Rachel found herself sitting on the porch, watching the world go by. The quiet of the neighborhood had always been soothing to her, but tonight, it only seemed to highlight the silence between her and Daniel. He hadn't come home yet, and the emptiness that had once felt comfortable now seemed suffocating. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. When she looked at the screen, her stomach lurched. It was a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. I'm worried about Daniel. I think you need to know something." Her heart raced as she stared at the message, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed a quick reply. "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "Someone who cares about you. Someone who knows what's really going on." Rachel's pulse quickened. She felt a familiar, creeping dread start to take hold. The air seemed to thicken around her as she read the message again. "What do you mean?" Another message appeared. "I can't tell you everything over text. But Daniel's been seeing someone else. He's been hiding it from you for a while now. I just thought you should know." The ground beneath her seemed to shift, like the very foundation of her life had just cracked open. For a moment, Rachel could barely breathe. Her mind reeled, her thoughts spiraling in every direction, none of them making sense. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then dropped to her lap, the phone now feeling like a lead weight in her hands. She had known. She had known for so long, hadn't she? The signs had been there, small, insidious clues she'd pushed aside, rationalized, or ignored. The late nights at the office, the constant secrecy, the guarded phone calls, and whispered conversations. The truth had been knocking on the door for months, and she had refused to let it in, but now, it was here. And it was undeniable. Rachel sat there for what felt like an eternity, her mind tumbling over itself as she tried to process the enormity of what she had just learned. Was this what Daniel had been hiding? Had he been seeing someone else all this time? Or had it only started recently? Her thoughts turned inwards. How long had he been lying to her? How long had she been blind to it all? She felt the sting of betrayal like a physical blow, the sharpness of it cutting through her chest. The front door creaked open, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. Rachel stood up quickly, clutching her phone to her chest as though it might give her some semblance of comfort. Her heart raced as Daniel walked into the room, his usual weary expression replacing the mask of detachment he had been wearing for days. For a split second, they just stood there, facing each other. He hadn't noticed the tension in the air, hadn't seen the storm brewing behind her eyes. But she could see the weariness in his face, the cracks in his facade. Something had changed in him, something she couldn't quite name yet. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice heavy with something that almost resembled concern. But there was something in his eyes that Rachel couldn't ignore. A flicker of guilt, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the weight of his own lies. Rachel didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked past him, her movements slow, deliberate. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind working through the labyrinth of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "I know," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel froze, his hand still resting on the doorframe, his eyes narrowing slightly as though he hadn't heard her correctly. "What?" "I know about her," Rachel repeated, her eyes never leaving his. "I know about the other woman." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that seemed to stretch on forever, heavy and suffocating. Rachel could feel the air in the room shift, the weight of his secret pressing down on them both. Then, Daniel let out a shaky laugh, but it was hollow. "Rachel, you don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice almost pleading, but Rachel could see the cracks now. She could see the way his hands shook, the way his eyes darted to the side. She had no doubt now, he was guilty. He had been hiding something from her, and now the truth was spilling out. "You don't get to lie to me anymore," Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet fury. "I know. And I deserve the truth." Daniel's face fell. For a moment, Rachel thought he might break down, might confess everything. But then he steeled himself, his expression hardening. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't know how to tell you." "Tell me what?" Rachel asked, stepping closer to him now, her eyes burning with the intensity of her anger. "That you've been lying to me for months? That I've been living in a house full of secrets?" Daniel's voice faltered, and for the briefest second, Rachel saw something in his eyes, something raw, something vulnerable. But it was gone in an instant. The silence stretched on, long and tense, until Daniel finally spoke again. His words came out in a low whisper, as though they were meant for her ears alone. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It wasn't supposed to be this way." Rachel stared at him, her mind swirling in a haze of disbelief. But she wasn't ready for the truth, not the truth he was about to reveal. "Not yet, I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I've already made my choice." And in that moment, Rachel knew. Everything was slipping away. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The air in the living room was thick with tension, the silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Rachel stood there, the floor beneath her feeling like it was slowly sinking, the weight of her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. Her breath was shallow, the cool air doing little to calm the storm brewing inside her. Everything inside her screamed to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The truth had already wrapped its cold fingers around her, and there was no getting away. Daniel's words hung in the air like a poison. "I've already made my choice." The finality of it tore through Rachel like a jagged knife. Her mind swirled, her body frozen, her limbs unwilling to obey the sudden surge of rage and hurt that coursed through her. The world outside the window seemed so distant, so irrelevant, as though she had been pulled into a different dimension, one where there was no escape from the crushing truth. This wasn't the life she'd signed up for. This wasn't what she had worked for. "You've made your choice?" Rachel's voice barely sounded like her own. It was raw, a rasp that carried the weight of so many unspoken words, of years of suppressed emotion. "You've made your choice, and you think it's that easy?" Her fists clenched, her nails digging into the palms of her hands, as though she could somehow anchor herself in the storm of emotions threatening to tear her apart. Daniel took a step back, his face contorted, a mixture of guilt and anger flashing across his features. He looked like he might say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, as though he was struggling to keep control of something just beneath the surface. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he said again, his voice thick with an emotion Rachel couldn't decipher. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Rachel shook her head, the sharpness of her movements betraying the panic she was trying to suppress. "How could it not be? How could you not see this coming? How could you be so blind to what this has done to me?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of her words had physically crushed him. But Rachel wasn't done. Her emotions were spiraling now, faster than she could grasp, each second drawing her deeper into the raw, painful truth of everything she had ignored for so long, the betrayal, the lies, the distance. It all crashed into her, a flood she couldn't stop. No matter how hard she tried to push it back, she moved closer to him, her body trembling now with the force of her anger. Her voice, when it came again, was sharp, cutting. "I've been here. I've been giving you everything I've had, Daniel. I've waited. And this is what I get? This? A lie that I've been living in for months? And now, you think you can just say you've made your choice and walk away?" The words tumbled out of her like an unstoppable torrent, her emotions flooding the space between them. She could feel her heart racing, the blood pumping so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. Daniel's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, and for the briefest moment, Rachel thought he might crack. Maybe, just maybe, he would finally break down and admit the truth. But then he hardened again, his jaw clenched tightly, his eyes narrowing as though he had made some sort of decision in that moment. "Rachel," he started, but the sound of her name on his lips only further fueled her anger. "You don't get to say my name like that anymore," she spat, her voice rising. "You don't get to pretend like we're still the people we were. We're not. You've crossed a line, Daniel. A line I can't unsee. You think I haven't noticed the way you look at her?" Rachel's words faltered as something else emerged in the pit of her stomach, a deep, guttural feeling of something darker, something deeper. Betrayal had so many faces, so many layers, and Rachel was suddenly struck by the weight of all of it, the secret nights, the words left unsaid, the glances exchanged behind her back. She had been blind, yes, but now she saw it all in crystal clear detail, and the truth was suffocating. Without warning, her hand shot out, slapping across his cheek with a force she hadn't known she was capable of. The sound of the slap echoed in the room, a deafening noise that snapped both of them into an eerie stillness. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her hand still trembling from the force of the blow. Daniel stood frozen, his face flushed, his eyes wide with shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He seemed to be processing the moment, as if the slap had stripped away the last layers of denial he had been holding on to. Rachel felt her body shaking, the adrenaline coursing through her, making her heart pound in her chest like a drum. She had never done anything like this before, never been so raw, so unrestrained. But in that instant, it was as if the rage that had built up inside of her for so long had taken over completely, pushing everything else aside. "You did this," she whispered, her voice breaking as the realization hit her with full force. "You pushed me into this corner, Daniel. You pushed me to see the truth." Daniel's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and something else, a sharp anger that Rachel couldn't quite place. But she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of any of it. Not the house, not the years they had spent together, not the memories that felt so fractured now. "You have no idea what you're doing," Daniel said, his voice low and tight, the words feeling more like a threat than a plea for understanding. "You're losing yourself. This isn't you." But Rachel was beyond hearing him now. She stepped back, the space between them widening like an abyss. She could feel her heart cracking into pieces as the truth settled like lead in her chest. The silence that followed felt unbearable, like a weight pressing down on her. Daniel's words, once a comfort, now felt hollow, empty. She had loved him. She had trusted him. And now, she couldn't look at him without seeing the lies, the deceit, the choices he had made behind her back. "Get out," Rachel whispered, the words soft but final. Daniel blinked, as though he hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared himself for the moment when she would turn away. "What?" "I said, get out," Rachel repeated, her voice stronger this time, though every fiber of her being screamed with pain. She was shaking now, not just with anger, but with the weight of the devastation settling in. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Rachel couldn't hear him anymore. She was too far gone. She could see the truth of it now, the broken pieces of her life scattered around her. The years she had wasted believing in a man who had only ever been a shadow of who he claimed to be. The trust that had once held everything together, now shattered into 1,000 pieces at her feet. "Just go," she said, her voice a whisper now, almost too quiet to hear. "Please. Just go." For a moment, Daniel stood there, unsure, unwilling to face the inevitable. But then he turned, his back to her, and walked out the door without a single word more. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, but it didn't bring any relief. Rachel stood there, staring at the empty doorway, the weight of his absence crushing her chest. The betrayal was complete. The lies had all been exposed. And now, there was nothing left but the quiet aftermath. Rachel sank to her knees, her body trembling with the aftermath of everything that had just happened. She had known this was coming. But no amount of knowing could prepare her for the reality of it. The house was silent now, empty, and for the first time, Rachel felt the full force of what it meant to be alone. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there, on the floor, the tears falling freely now. Maybe it didn't matter. All that mattered was the weight of her own heart breaking in her chest. And the sound of the door clicking shut behind Daniel, leaving her with nothing but the remnants of a life that had once felt so certain. But now, nothing was certain. Not anymore. The days following Daniel's departure were a blur to Rachel. Each one stretched into the next, indistinguishable from the last, a continuous gray fog that wrapped around her, muffling everything. It was as if the world outside had moved on, continuing with its rhythms and routines, while she remained in a stasis, trapped in the aftershock of the confrontation. The house, once full of laughter, arguments, love, was now hollow, empty, a shell of its former self. And so was she. She had barely left the house. At first, there had been a numbness that kept her still. She moved through her days in a mechanical way, almost as though she were pretending to exist. She ate, she slept, and she let the days crawl by, each one blending into the next. Sometimes, her mind would slip back into that moment when Daniel had finally walked out. She could still see the door closing behind him, that finality hanging in the air like a thick fog. The sound of his retreating footsteps still echoed in her mind. Rachel had expected to feel anger, but it was the absence of anger that unsettled her. Instead, there was a quiet emptiness, a cold void, that seemed to stretch into infinity. Was this what betrayal did to a person? Made them feel like a shell, a hollow version of themselves, haunted by ghosts of the past. For the first few days, she hadn't heard from Daniel. His absence was like a dark weight on her chest, but there was also a strange sense of relief that came with it. She no longer had to endure the silence in the room when he was there, nor the unspoken tension that lingered between them. But then the messages began. The first one came late one night. Her phone buzzed softly, a message from an unknown number, just like the one that had alerted her to his infidelity. I told you what you needed to know. Don't let him get away with this. He needs to pay for what he did to you. Rachel stared at the message, her heart sinking. The words felt too calculated, too cold. It wasn't enough that Daniel had betrayed her, now someone else was manipulating the situation, pushing her into a place she didn't want to go. She had no idea who this person was, but the idea that someone, anyone, was still trying to control her narrative felt suffocating. It was as though the truth was being twisted by invisible hands. What do you want from me? Rachel typed back, her fingers trembling. The response came quickly. I can help you expose him. I have proof. You need to know everything. Rachel didn't respond. The temptation to engage was there, but she couldn't bring herself to ask for more details. There was a part of her that was afraid that opening this door would only take her deeper into a hole she didn't want to fall into. The truth, as much as it had cut her, was already more than she could bear. She didn't want to know anything else. She didn't want to see the complete devastation Daniel had caused, didn't want to know how far the lies had spread. As the days passed, the void began to grow. She couldn't stay in the house forever. The walls were closing in, and the isolation was driving her mad. Her friends, her family, none of them had reached out. Not in the way that she had hoped, at least. The silence from her parents was the hardest to bear. They had always been supportive of her relationship with Daniel, and now, in the wake of everything, they didn't know what to say. They couldn't even offer a word of comfort, couldn't even acknowledge the weight of what she was going through. But it wasn't just her family's silence that bothered her. It was the fact that the world around her seemed to have moved on with little notice. The betrayal had been a quiet one, and in a world where headlines were full of scandals and violence, her pain felt small, insignificant. Then came the media. A subtle murmur at first, but before long, it was impossible to ignore. Someone had leaked details of Daniel's affair. Her name wasn't attached to the stories, but it didn't matter. The speculation was there, and with it came a wave of unwanted attention. At first, Rachel hadn't been sure what to make of the stories. They were mostly gossip, vague hints of a crumbling marriage, of a man who had cheated and walked away without looking back. She had thought the media's involvement would hurt her, but instead, it felt like another layer of distance between herself and reality. It made the whole situation feel even more surreal, like she was reading about someone else's pain. The part that stung was the way people spoke about Daniel. They seemed so quick to justify him, to downplay the affair, painting him as a man caught up in a moment of weakness. No one seemed to question the damage he'd caused, the years of lies he'd built between them. It was all too easy for people to look at a story like this and reduce it to simple drama, a quick scandal, a brief blip in their otherwise perfect lives, but the stories weren't as kind to her. The comments, the whispers, those were impossible to ignore. The betrayal wasn't just something between Daniel and herself anymore, it was now a public affair. And as much as Rachel wanted to retreat into the shadows and hide, she couldn't escape the way it felt to have her life laid bare. Her guilt began to set in. She had made the decision to cut him off, to kick him out, but now that the reality of that decision was sinking in, she wondered if she had done the right thing. Could they have fixed it if she had tried harder? Every time she thought she might be ready to let go of those questions, another wave of self-doubt crashed over her, pulling her under. Maybe it wasn't the affair that had destroyed her, maybe it was the way she had let herself unravel in the wake of it. Maybe she had never really known herself, or worse, had never really known who Daniel had been. The loneliness weighed on her. The questions didn't stop. The accusations didn't stop. And no one seemed to have answers. Was she a victim? Or had she been complicit in some way, unknowingly laying the foundation for this destruction? And what about Daniel? Did he even feel guilty, or had he simply walked away, leaving her to face the mess alone? Her emotions were a storm, and she had no idea how to navigate the aftermath. There were days when she could hardly recognize herself, when she thought about her life with Daniel and felt a profound sense of loss, not for the relationship, but for the person she had been before the truth shattered everything. She had been so sure, so certain that she knew what love was, that she knew what it meant to trust someone, but trust was a fragile thing, and the damage had been done. As she sat in the small, quiet apartment she had moved into, the emptiness of it surrounding her, Rachel realized something. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about who she had become in the wake of it. The person who had been so sure of herself, of her worth, had been swallowed by the very thing that was supposed to bring her peace, love. And now, all that was left was the hollow space of what could have been. The questions, the media, the whispers, none of it mattered. What mattered now was how she would rebuild from the ashes. Because, somehow, she had to. Months had passed since Daniel's departure, and Rachel's world had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. The days had blurred together, the painful rawness of the betrayal slowly dulling into something more manageable, but still deeply unsettling. She had found a new rhythm in her life, one that didn't involve waking up to the man who had once promised to be her partner in every sense of the word. Instead, she had learned to move through the world with the heavy weight of a scar she could never quite ignore. She still thought about him sometimes, mostly in fleeting, unexpected moments. The way his laugh used to sound when he was truly happy, the way they used to joke about their plans for the future. She still had memories of him that felt like a part of her, memories she could never erase entirely, no matter how hard she tried. But those memories were no longer her present. They were a distant past, one that no longer had any claim on her. Daniel's absence in her life was felt, but it wasn't as painful as it had been. In the early days, she had felt like she was drowning, like she was being buried alive, beneath the weight of her own emotions. Now, there was a quietness to her world that allowed her to breathe, even if every breath came with the residue of past wounds. There were moments when she found herself wondering about Daniel, where he was, what he was doing. She had seen a few articles in the media, hinting at a new life, a new relationship, but she never sought them out. The old Rachel would have been consumed by jealousy, would have needed to know every detail. But that Rachel was gone. And in her place was someone who had begun to understand the value of stepping away from the wreckage, of letting go of things that no longer served her. Rachel had started therapy a few weeks after Daniel left. At first, it had felt pointless, as though there was no way to untangle the mess that was her life. But over time, she came to see it as a tool for rebuilding herself. It wasn't easy, confronting all the ways she had allowed herself to be manipulated, to be blinded by love. But it was necessary. Therapy helped her unearth the pieces of herself she had forgotten, the parts that had been buried under the weight of guilt and shame. She had become more than just a victim of betrayal. She had begun to rebuild herself, brick by brick, until one day, she realized she was whole again, not perfect, but whole. And that was enough. As for Daniel, Rachel had heard little from him since the day he walked out. His messages had stopped coming, and any attempts he had made to reach out to her were quickly brushed aside. It was clear to Rachel that, for him, the affair had been a means to an end. She had been a chapter in his life that he was eager to close, leaving her to piece together the shattered remnants of a future they had once shared. From what she had gathered through the media and the occasional friend of a friend gossip, Daniel hadn't fared much better than she had. His life seemed to have spiraled, though not in the way Rachel had expected. His new relationship was rocky, as though the cracks that had begun to form in his marriage had only deepened with time. But Rachel didn't pity him. The man she had loved had chosen a different path, a path of lies and manipulation, and now he was paying the price. She didn't want to know the details of his downfall, his regrets or his justifications. It was enough for her that he was no longer in her life, that she no longer had to carry the weight of his betrayal. But the story didn't end there, not entirely. As time wore on, Rachel began to realize that the true impact of what had happened wasn't just confined to her or Daniel. It rippled outward, touching everyone they knew, forcing people to reconsider their own relationships, their own assumptions about loyalty and trust. Rachel's family, too, had begun to question the dynamics of their own lives. Her mother, especially, had been devastated by what Daniel had done, and yet, as time passed, Rachel saw that it had also opened a door for her mother to confront her own relationship with her husband, who had long been emotionally distant. It was as though the betrayal had forced everyone around her to reflect on their own vulnerabilities, to reconsider what truly mattered in their relationships. Rachel hadn't wanted to be anyone's cautionary tale. She hadn't wanted her pain to serve as a warning to others, but in a strange way, it had. It had forced people to look at their own lives more closely, to reevaluate the choices they were making, the promises they were breaking, and yet, despite everything, Rachel felt no bitterness toward those who had failed her. The betrayal was still fresh, still stung with a sharpness that would never fully go away, but she had come to understand something important in the process. Betrayal, though it can destroy, also has the power to rebuild. It has the power to strip you down to the core, to force you to confront who you really are beneath the surface. In the quiet moments when she would look in the mirror, Rachel could see the change in her own eyes. There was a strength there now, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had survived the worst thing she thought could happen to her, and in doing so, she had become more than just a victim. She had become someone who could walk away from the past without looking back, someone who knew that the future was hers to shape. The world had continued spinning, indifferent to her personal tragedy, and Rachel had learned to accept that. There would always be people who betrayed others, who tore apart the lives they touched. But what mattered in the end wasn't the betrayal itself, it was how you chose to respond to it. It was how you chose to rebuild, to move forward when the world seemed intent on holding you back. Rachel had learned to trust again, not blindly, but with the wisdom that only comes from facing the darkness and emerging on the other side. She had learned that while love could break you, it could also heal you, if you were brave enough to face the consequences of your choices. And as she sat by the window one evening, looking out at the city she had once shared with Daniel, Rachel finally understood. Betrayal, though it could shatter everything, could also set you free. It had set her free. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. In the quiet aftermath of betrayal, we find our true selves. It is not the lies we tell, but the truths we uncover, that define who we become.